Well, I'd like to welcome our audiences this evening. My name is Wendy Oppers, and I work for Environment and Parks. I'm going to host tonight. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our 2016 Winter Speakers Series called Footprints on the Landscape. I want to thank our partners who helped put together and coordinate and sponsor this series. It's Alberta Parks, Chinook Arch Regional Library System, the RISE Network, the Pincher Creek Municipal Library, and Alberta Environment and Parks. Tonight we're going to hear from Scott Murphy. He's the Fire Management Officer in Waterton Lakes National Park. And he's going to chat with us about fire management in Waterton Lakes National Park and the recent prescribed and wildfire experiences. Parks Canada uses prescribed burns in their fire programs, and it contributes to the environmental health of the national park by bringing fire back to the landscape under planned circumstances. And then he's going to tell us a little bit about what happens when fire becomes an unplanned event in a national park. A little bit about Scott, which I thought was really interesting, is he's a fire management officer in Waterton Lakes National Park. He's held this position for the past 3 years. Scott came to Waterton Lakes from Parks Canada National Fire Centre, which is based in Calgary, where he worked for 7 years, helping to coordinate fire management activities in national parks all across the country. So I think that national experience is going to be interesting to hear about. Scott began his career in fire as a heli-tac firefighter with the province of Alberta while studying forestry at the University of New Brunswick. His first trip to Waterton Lakes was in 1999. While gainfully employed as a busboy at Kilmorey Lodge, he met his future wife, Paige, while folding napkins at table number 4. The two now live in Pincher Creek with their 3 children, Georgia, Jack, and Theo. So welcome, Scott, and you can start your presentation.
Thanks for inviting me tonight, and thanks everybody for showing up. As Wendy mentioned, my name is Scott Murphy, and I'm the Fire Management Officer in Waterton. And perhaps it is the first time you've ever met a Fire Management Officer, so I hope you're not disappointed. Here I am, and I'm going to disappear for a little while and show you some pictures, and hopefully after the next 45 minutes you'll have a better understanding of what fire management is and what it looks like in a national park like Waterton. So, if you can take us live. So here we go. There's a beautiful lake. If you've ever been to Waterton, that's a shot looking down Upper Waterton Lake towards Montana. That's the Waterton town site in the foreground. And photographer there is one of our fire people in the park, Ryan Perniak, and that was taken from up beside the Prince of Wales.
And God going after Trump at the other end of the lake.
Yeah, one summer evening about 2 years ago. So, for those that don't know, and there's many that don't, Waterton is in the extreme southwest corner of Alberta, right up against the boundaries with British Columbia and Montana. It's a relatively small national park. It's about 525 square kilometers, and it's the Canadian half of the world's first international peace park. Glacier National Park, across the U.S. border to the south there, is makes up the other half of that. Here's where Waterton fits in the grand scheme of things, our national park system in Canada. There are 42 national parks and 167 national historic sites like the Bayou Ranch. So Parks Canada is responsible for fire management in all of those parks. So just because a national park lands in a province, it's not the province that's responsible for fire management in that park. It is Parks Canada. We have our own dedicated fire management program. Parks Canada is a member agency of the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre. It's a little building in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and their role is to help coordinate fire management activities between all the provincial and territorial fire management agencies in the country. We, as a member agency of CIFC, we help develop national standards for training and equipment. And that allows us to share firefighting equipment and firefighters in times of need when things are busy elsewhere and we're able to free ourselves up. So fire management in the 21st century. Historically, fire management concentrated more on the negative impacts. And so if you think back to the days of Smokey the Bear and only you can prevent forest fires, they did a really good job of drilling that into our heads that fire is bad and leads to nothing but loss and destruction. More recently, we've come to realize that there are also positive effects and impacts of fire as well. And so fire management in the national parks in the 21st century, it's all about maximizing the positive impacts while trying to minimize the negative impacts. And I'm going to use three of our relatively recent experiences in Waterton to sort of help demonstrate how we use fire and then also how we fight fires that threaten values in the parks. So Waterton in particular, there are two species or ecosystems that benefit from fire and that we proactively use fire for their benefit. One is white bark pine. You see a little pine tree there on the left. And the other is foothills rough fescue. And that's one of the primary species that we see in our beautiful grasslands on the east side of Waterton out in the prairies. This picture here shows a forest, and if you look carefully, you can see a lot of gray, white tree stems. Those are all dead white bark pine. These white bark pine are quite spectacular trees. The wonderful thing about working with white bark pine is that they take you to wonderful places. They grow up on high mountain ridges up in the subalpine, and when you're up there with your white bark pine, you can't help but have a wonderful view in at least one direction. They're quite large trees and can live for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, in many areas of the park, we've seen stands like this where mortality in the white bark pine has been up to 90%. And that's largely because of an introduced pathogen disease called white pine blister rust that came over to North America from overseas many years ago. And it spread throughout Canada, and it's been quite hard, in particular in the trees in Waterton. White bark pine, they produce a pine cone like everybody else. These pine trees don't rely on fire like some of our other pine species, like lodgepole pine. They don't have a serotinous cone that needs to be opened by the heat. They rely on Clark's nutcracker, a bird, to come in and collect the seeds, and then the bird caches them in the ground like a squirrel to pick up later on. And the seeds that they don't get back to, those are the ones that turn into white bark pine trees down the road. And they require wide open spaces where they can get the full sunlight, and they don't get outcompeted for other resources. So you can see here that after the white bark pine died, other trees like subalpine fern and Engelmann spruce have really crowded in. And it's a pretty hard place for a little white bark pine to make a go of it. So our strategy to help them out is to go into the subalpine and light these prescribed fires. And what we're trying to simulate is the small little lightning fires that would have naturally occurred there in the past. And we believe there are some trees that have survived in the park, so we believe they have a genetic resistance to this white pine blister rust. So in the summer, we'll go up in the trees, we'll climb up the trees and put cages around the cones when they're just starting to develop at the first of the summer. We come back at the end of the summer and hope that the squirrels haven't gotten into the cages. We collect those cones. We take the seeds out of the cones. It's quite a large seed, about the size of a pine nut, like you would use for making your pesto. And we send them to a nursery, and they grow these trees. And after we have our little fire, we go out into the forest and we plant the trees out there in the hopes that they'll be there in another couple hundred years. So this is how we make our opening in the forest. This piece of equipment you see in the foreground, we call that a terra torch. Terra is in earth, so we use that for burning from the ground as opposed to from the helicopter. And it's a mixture of fuel. It's basically a fancy flamethrower, and we fly it up to where we need it, and then we start these fires. And we're able to do this safely because we can use the terra torch to burn when the forest is relatively damp. So if you were to drive into Waterton on a day like this, you would have seen the fire danger sign at low. And basically the only way that we're going to get a fire to spread through there is by having that terra torch there. So we pull the trigger and we get a little forest fire. When we let go of the trigger, the fire dies down and it doesn't spread anywhere. So we don't have to worry about it spreading any further than we want to and threatening any of the infrastructure in the park or getting out in the park onto our neighbor's land. So the picture on your right there, that's sort of what it looks like when it's done. That fire was about a little over 1 hectare, so about the size of 2 football fields. So again, what you might expect from a small lightning fire in the mountains. That's what it looks like on the ground. And this is a few weeks afterwards. We send our tree planting crew in. The picture on the right there, you can see 3 of our little white bark pine seedlings that we've grown in the nursery from those seeds that we collected a couple years previous. We stick those in the ground and we give them all a name and we measure them and see how tall they are. And we'll come back and visit those and check on things like survivorship and their ability to deal with competition and the white pine blister rust, and just make sure that our assumptions about their resistance are true. So, our fescue grasslands, that's a fescue, it's like a bunch grass. So if you see on the left-hand side there, that's what a mature fescue looks like. The picture on the right is actually, it is in Waterton. We have a demonstration herd of bison. You can see them there in the foreground to the left beside the water. They are inside of a paddock. They're not free-ranging. But right now there are 13 inside the paddock with probably some calves on the way. And the population ranges from about a dozen up to about 25 is sort of the carrying capacity. But those beautiful grasslands all behind them, that's all the nice fescue. And this is quite an interesting story. So there's 2 pictures here taken at the exact same place about 90 years apart. The picture on the left was taken in 1914 by a group of surveyors. Worked for the federal government. The Dominion Land Survey, I believe, was a department back in the day. And they were out here doing a survey of Western Canada. And they used this wonderful photogrammetry technique where they would hike to all these prominent spots on the landscape. They would set up their camera and they would take pictures in every direction. And they do that hundreds of spots all up and down the Rocky Mountains from Waterton all the way up through Jasper into the Wilmore Wilderness. And then they were better at math than me because they'd take those pictures back and they'd do some trigonometry and whatnot. And they could figure out elevations and distances. And this is actually the technique they used to make the first topographic maps of the Rocky Mountains.
So are those 1914 photographs available in Waterton anywhere?
They are. So if you, that website on the top there, if you go to mountainlegacy.ca, you can see all the, you can download those as high resolution images. And so the neat thing, somebody stumbled upon these, probably 20 years ago now, in the National Archives in Ottawa. And it took them a little while to figure out what it was and what they were, because they weren't well cataloged. Some of them were broken. They didn't have great descriptions. But when they figured out what it was, they concluded they had quite a treasure. So someone came up with a grand idea of revisiting all these old locations, trying to find the exact spot where they had set up their camera, and then retake the exact same picture. And so they did that all up and down the Rocky Mountains for years, many field seasons. And they have quite a collection now. And again, if you have hours to kill, that www.mountainlegacy.ca is a wonderful place to go. And they have some neat tools there. But yeah, so what we're trying to illustrate here today is just sort of the change in vegetation. Historically, there would have been, millions of bison roaming the landscape, and the Blackfoot, the indigenous folks in the area, were great users of fires themselves for a variety of reasons. So in the absence of bison, the absence of fire, we started to see this encroachment of shrubs and vegetation out into the grasslands. And for folks around here, this is a problem that's quite common to the ranchers as well, and they deal with it themselves. They're frequently out there with big mowers trying to beat back the edges on their pastures and whatnot so they don't lose productive land. So we have the same issue. So there's one shot that illustrates. Here's another one out on the Eskerine, sort of looking to the northwest, someone out of the park. You can see the old wagon trail on the left picture on the way into Waterton town site. There's one looking more straight south. That's Mount Vimy. That's the prominent mountain there. That's the one that's right across from the present-day town site. You can see that the patches of shrubs have really sort of expanded. And then as the shrubs start to, they collect the snow and the moisture, makes it a better site for the trees. The trees set in, and then it's sort of this positive feedback loop. So that's what encroachment looks like. There's a lovely picture of me on the left-hand side. And the encroachment is very incremental. It happens year over year, where the forest edge just starts to migrate out into the prairies. And so the math on this is that we've lost almost 30% of the grasslands in Waterton due to this forest and shrub encroachment over the years. And so, yeah, the strategy here is that we use fire to try and beat back the shrubs and the aspen. The picture on the right, you can see the fire went through the grass, and there's a little bit of ash and whatnot there, but it wasn't a particularly hot fire. It didn't probably even burn all the grass there. There's still some litter underneath that, so no loss of soil or anything like that. But the stems and those little saplings are sufficiently burned there that they're dead. So folks certainly from around Pincher probably recognize the fellow on the left. That's Charlie Russell, famous naturalist from the area, known for his work with bears. And Charlie lives just to the north of the park, up in a wonderful spot called the Hawk's Nest up on a hill. And Charlie will sit in his house on his porch and look down at us with his binoculars. And he caught me one day and he said, "I don't know how you guys do that." He said, "I see you out there for months at a time, running around there lighting fires, and knock on wood," he's like, "you've never had a problem yet. Like, how do you guys do that?" I said, "Well, we're very careful. That's secret number one. Be very careful." And we do start very early. The picture on the right was taken in February. So this is Chinook country, obviously. Snow comes and snow goes. The other thing that the wind is really good at is piling up snow in certain places. So you see that slight depression in the prairies just to the left of the fire. That catches enough snow, we can use that to our advantage. So we'll sneak out there in February or March, months before we plan on burning anything else, and start putting in these little black lines in between the snowdrifts as opportunities present themselves. There's other little tricks we know, like if you look at that fire there, you'll see that the wind is blowing from right to left. So we would call that fire, the flames on the left-hand side, we would call that the head of the fire. You can see those flames are much taller than the flames on the right-hand side that are backing into the wind. So we use the way that fire burns to our advantage as well. We try to minimize the amount of head fire that we see out there and try to do all of our burning with a backing fire, and it makes it much easier to control. So here's one black line stretching across the prairie. This was 7 kilometers of this that we did over the course of about a month and a half. And some days you only get 100 or 200 meters, and some days you get a kilometer. But it is windy country down here, so when the wind's not blowing, you sneak out there and you get what you can. And after a couple of months, you have a nice black line stretching across the prairie. That little instrument in the foreground, that's called a drip torch. So you put a mixture of gas and diesel in that, about 50-50. So it burns nice and hot, but it's not overly explosive. And that little pigtail in the stem, that keeps the fire from getting back up the tube and into the tank. So that's our little safety measure. And there's a wick on the very end of that. And so we'll light that wick and we walk along and we tip that down. The fuel will drip down out of the spout across the burning wick and land on the grass, and that lights our fire. So some of these burns are quite big. A drip torch works well, but it's slow going. When we have large areas like the Eskerine, which was about 1,600 hectares, that we want to light, again, while we have the opportunity, we use other tools. So this is flying around. We light this from the air. You can see in that hopper, I'll send some around here, we have these little plastic balls, and we call them pings, as in ping pong balls. Or there's another trademark for them. Those ones I've just sent around, they're actually called dragon eggs. And inside of them, if you shake them, you can hear a little powder in there. It's potassium permanganate. And so we use a chemical reaction. So the balls you see in that hopper, they drop down through a little machine. And the needle goes into the side of the ball, injects it with glycol, antifreeze. And it kicks off an exothermic reaction, releases a lot of heat, but it's delayed. So it has time to drop down from the helicopter. About 30 seconds after it's injected with glycol, it bursts into flame. And then you get a pattern like you see on the ground there, of these little round circles. And that's how we're able to do it and keep firefighters safe and cover large areas of ground. So that's what you see. There's a few flight lines there stacked up behind each other. Those black circles will all join together and into a nice straight line of fire and march away downwind to that black line that we put in months before. And if you're really lucky, the forecast says that it was going to snow the next day. So this is a picture from actually the next day after that one, and it makes you look like a real pro when it snows the next day, and it helps you sleep at night as well. So that's sort of what you always hope for. So that's the positive impacts, and that's how we use fire to the ecosystem's benefit in Waterton. In other national parks across the country, they have other issues and other species who are adapted in slightly different ways, but they also find ways, whether it's red oak or pitch pine or some other shrubs or flowers. We use fire in national parks all across the country. So this was my excitement for the summer. This is the downside of fire. So we're going to talk about the Waterton Lake fire that happened this summer, August 14th. And this is the fire, ever since I got here 3 years ago, this is the one that sort of keeps me up at night sometimes, the one I spend a lot of time thinking about, because the last time this happened in 1935, it got quite big. And this is another one. It started, you can see the map of the fire on the west side of Upper Waterton Lake. The north end of the lake there, you can see Waterton Park. That's where our town site is. And the fire started there on the slopes of Mount Campbell and came across the Canada-US border and came awfully close to the town site before a rain shower came in and a wind switch, and it sort of saved the day. But those pictures on the right, was the view from Waterton that day. So that would have been a pretty scary thing to be looking down the lake at, and it was to the point where folks had all their earthly belongings tied to the roof of the car and were ready to head out. So I've kind of confused you here. I've got north isn't up on this map that you see. North is actually off to the right. So again, there's the Waterton town site. About halfway down the lake, that's the Canada-US border. And then at the south end of the lake in yellow, that was the perimeter of the Waterton Lake fire this summer. If you look really hard, just to the left of the U and upper, you can see a little creek coming into the lake there. And Glacier National Park, Montana, the U.S. Glacier National Park, they have a little ranger station there called Goat Haunt. It's also an official U.S. port of entry, so the Border Services folks are there, and it's also a headquarters for the U.S. Border Patrol. So it's the back of beyond as far as they're concerned, but it's a busy little spot. So a little bit of foreshadowing. This is an email that I sent out the afternoon of August 14th. So I'll just read it for you, the important part. So it says it's a tie with August 26, 1958 for the 27th driest day on record in the Waterton town site. Which doesn't really mean nothing, but I thought it was just of interest that day, so I thought I'd just send it out. And you can see highlighted below, it seems like we will get at least some rain this evening, but it is coming with lightning. So sometimes when we get into these long stretches of hot weather in the summer, intuitively you would think that if rain is coming, then hooray, we've all been saved. But often with rain comes lightning, and if you don't get enough rain, then it's not much good to you. The lightning can cause you some grief. So, meteorologists at the Provincial Fire Center, so talking to the folks in Edmonton, suggested we could get up to 10 millimeters over the course of the weekend. When things get really hot and dry, we change the shifts for the fire crews. We start them later in the day, and we keep them on later in the day. And we had put a fire ban on just the day before on the 13th, recognizing that things were getting sort of to a critical stage. These numbers down in the bottom of the screen will probably mean not much to you, but that's how fire management officers track how dry the forests are. So we have a series of weather stations in the park, and every day from 2 weeks ago until probably Halloween, we'll go out there and take the weather at 12 o'clock every day. And we take the temperature, the RH, the wind speed, and the precipitation over the last 24 hours. And we have a book here full of tables, and we stick those weather values through our tables, and that's how we get these numbers. And these numbers tell me how dry different sizes of fuels are in the forest. So that column that says FFMC, that represents fine fuels, so dead needles, twigs, grass, anything up to the size of your pinky finger. The DMC is the next sort of size class of fuels. That would be sort of anything up to the size of your wrist. The DC is stuff the size of your leg or bigger, like full trees. And the BUI is a representation of basically all those three things added together, like how much fuel is in the forest available to burn today. So those are pretty high numbers. So when we get big numbers like that, we get ready for it. We call this pre-suppression. So we're not putting anything out yet, but we're getting ready to put something out. So here's another fantastic picture. This is taken by Ryan, our fire management technician in Waterton. There's another website for you to check out while you're looking at the repeat photography stuff. But that's a picture of the helicopter at the warden office in Waterton, and it's parked there one night, and that big fantastic cloud behind it, that's what starts fires. That's a big cumulonimbus thunder cloud floating out of the Red Rock Valley at night, and that's inter cloud lightning that's going off right now, lighting up that big cloud, and the beautiful starry night behind it. It's wonderful. Until it does that. So that was not the same storm, but that's what it looked like. And the fire this summer started during the day, as you'll see here shortly. But the funny thing is that it started in almost the exact same spot. That big lightning bolt you see right there is hitting the mountain that the fire started on this year. So this is pretty dry reading. This is straight out of the radio log at the warden office. But I'll walk you through a few key ones. So as these things always happen, it happens after 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon when most people have gone home. We got a scratchy report of smoke a half mile north of Goat Haunt. That's the U.S. Ranger Station down at the end of the lake. From Shoreline Cruises. So there's some charter boats that run sightseeing tours up and down the lakes. And they watched the lightning bolt hit the side of the mountain. They saw a tree burst into flames. And they get on the radio and they told Goat Haunt. I don't know if you are able to recall, but it had been a really hot and dry July and August all through the Pacific Northwest United States. And the United States were totally maxed out. They had all the fire they could handle. Nationally, they were at what they call level 5, which means basically all the resources they have are deployed, and they're starting to bring in people from other countries. That's when you hear these stories about folks coming from Australia or New Zealand or South Africa to help out. That's sort of the situation they were in. So recognizing that, the ranger down there gave us a shout on the radio and said, "Can you guys please come have a look at that?" And so we did. So within 10 minutes of the initial report, the crew had made their way out to the helicopter. They had fired up the helicopter, let it warmed up, and they had pulled off the helipad, and they were just coming around the corner of the Prince of Wales, and they were immediately able to see smoke down the lake. And they radioed back to me in the office, and I said, "Oh boy, here we go." So we did a quick check down to Goat Haunt just to make sure we had the blessings of Border Patrol. We weren't going to get shot out of the air by a Black Hawk or anything like that. And they said, "Yeah, please come on down." And then all that black stuff in the middle is us scurrying around trying to get people out of the way. We had to sweep a hiking trail that runs down the lake. We had U.S. Park Service crews out working actually on the boundary cut. And we had to put several closures in place. So it all happened very quick. And then you can see there in the last line, just about 2 hours after the fire started, a little shower came down the valley. And we got sufficient rain that things were able to settle down. So this is what it looks like visually. So this was taken about an hour after the fire started, but this is basically how it would have been detected. It would have been folks on this boat looking over there where the fire is, seeing a lightning bolt touch the top of a tree and seeing a big puff of smoke. This is our crew heading down the lake 13 minutes after the first report. You can see there's already a fair bit of smoke. The U.S.-Canada border there, you can kind of see a sandy shoreline about 3 points up. That's basically where the Canada-U.S. border is. Here's the first lap of the fire. At that point, they were saying it was about the size of a football field. So things were pretty dry. There's a little bit of wind. Things were getting big quick. There's a couple hours in, we're starting to see some pretty good Flame lengths. Definitely bigger than a football field now. And that's our rain shower a couple hours in. So that's when we got our first break. Wasn't enough rain to put it out, but it was enough to settle it down and make it safe for firefighters to get in there and start laying hose straight directly to the fire. We went for a flight down to the fire just before dark. So after that rain shower went through, and we noted that already the fire was starting to sort of reorganize itself, and we were seeing, flame fronts a couple hundred feet long around the perimeter starting to reorganize and build again. And so the effects of the rain, we're already starting to lose our advantages of that. And then later on that night, so here's 11 o'clock from Prince of Wales Hill again, looking down the lake. You could see some flames and some pretty good glow. So it was a long ways from out at this point. So with that in mind, we had a forecast for, I believe it was a 40% chance of showers through the night, and wind speeds 40 kilometers an hour, gusting up to 60. So, like I say, better safe than sorry. Those kinds of winds and that little amount of rain, there was still potential for the fire to get uncomfortably close to the town site. So we put folks on an evacuation alert. We went door to door and let folks know that if the fire started to move towards town and we thought there was going to be an issue, we'd be back to notify them. And when we came back the second time, they'd have to be out of the park within 1 hour. So it wasn't a decision we took lightly, but again, better safe than sorry. So as I mentioned earlier, our neighbors were totally tapped out. So, we did all this initial action that evening. Phoned down to my counterpart in Glacier, and he said, "Well, what do you think? What do you think you guys need in terms of resources?" And I said to Dave, I talked to my boss, and we can take this one for you guys. We know you guys are totally tapped out, and I think we made his day. You could hear the sigh of relief in his and the happiness in his voice. So we formalized it. This letter in front of you, that's what we call a delegation of authority. So that's the United States National Park Service delegating authority to Parks Canada to go down there into America and fight that fire on their behalf. And the few points there you see are sort of the guidelines that they gave us to keep in mind as we were doing it. So it'd say things, the first point I believe talks about firefighter and public safety being the primary issue, and things that we need to be concerned about in terms of their sensitive ecosystems and whatnot. So that's what it looked like the next morning. It did get windy, but the showers did show up. So it had settled down quite a bit by the next morning. But again, not enough rain to put it out by itself. So we had to start moving crews in there, and we set up lots of pumps. We had helicopters with big water buckets bringing lots of water, and it took about 10 days, I guess it was, before we pulled everybody off and put it into patrol status, and then probably another week after that before we felt comfortable in saying it was out. The final size was 10 hectares, about 25 acres. So certainly not a big fire, but also plenty big enough given the location.
What was the date of their fire?
August 14th. Oh, their fires that had them also busy? There were several going on, and they were actually fighting fires outside of the park on behalf of the state of Montana as well.
Yeah, like that big one that ran along the highway.
Yeah, that was a couple weeks earlier, I believe. Yeah. So this is, we were out in there putting out fire and running hose, and one of the guys came across what we call the lightning tree. So this is kind of a neat thing that you're able to find sometimes in a fire, because sometimes they just burn up or they fall down and you're not able to see it. But if you look at the tree there right in front of that firefighter and you look up the tree, you'll see a yellow spiral of wood. And that's a big chunk of wood that's been blown out the side of that tree. And that was the lightning hit this tree, and it traveled all the way down the ground, blowing the wood out of the side of that tree. And if you look carefully over here, to the left, you can see a shard of that tree, about 6 feet long, hung up in the branch of a tree beside it. And so that's how lightning start fires. Some of those shards that would have hit the ground would have been on fire, and the forest was sufficiently dry that it was able to pick up and go from there. As I mentioned, the forest was very dry, so if you look in the bottom left corner there, you can see the root system on that tree is burned out, and that tree is perched very precariously over our firefighters. So one of the things they have to do to make them safe is to go around and find these trees, assess how likely they are to fall over, and then cut them down if it's deemed to be enough of a hazard. So you can see the firefighters there working in the foreground. They're just trying to get as much of that burning forest cooled down before they drop a fresh tree on top of those hotbed of coals. Lots of falling trees, so that's always a hazard. Firefighters do get hit and killed by trees that are burned out, so it's something we're always on the lookout for. It can turn into quite a tangle, so that's 1.5 inch fire hose that she's got over her shoulder there. You can see she's leaning into it with all her might, trying to drag that through the forest. And it is hard work, but it is satisfying work. That's a picture of me there on the left with one of our senior firefighters, Randall, came to help us from Prince Albert National Park in Saskatchewan. And one of our locals there, some of you may recognize Marie. She was in to help feed the troops. Takes lots of calories to be out there for up to 14 hours a day, hauling all that gear up and down mountains. Steep slopes and heavy packs, so lots of potential for twisted ankles and knees and strains. The bags that the hose come in, they're packed with 400 feet of hose. So they weigh about 45 pounds when they're dry and about 60 pounds when the hose is wet on the way down. The pumps weigh about 60 pounds. Our personal day packs usually weigh around 35 pounds. So good leg muscles at the end of a summer. And this was our morning commute on the fire. It was kind of a neat fire in that perspective. Often in these remote locations we use helicopters to get in and out of our fires. But this fire, conveniently located on the side of the lake, made boat travel a pretty nice option. And though the Americans weren't able to offer up too many firefighters, they were fantastic in terms of medevac support. So they were looking after us from a first aid perspective. And they also had this wonderful big work barge that was great for moving firefighters up and down the lake. And there's the happy ending. So that's the Parks Canada firefighters down at the Goat Haunt Ranger Station at the end of the lake at the end of a good day. And so that pretty much concludes everything that I had for you. So hopefully you have a bit of an idea now of what fire management looks like in national parks and how we use fire for ecological benefits and how we're able to respond to fire when our towns and people and infrastructure are at risk.
Hi, Scott. So those of you joining us this evening, that was a really fascinating presentation, Scott, about fires in national parks and responding, and particularly that international cooperation that goes on amongst the firefighting community, not just here in Alberta but elsewhere. We'd like to thank Scott for his great presentation. Waterton always contributes to the speaker series with some phenomenal topics that our audiences really enjoy. I really personally enjoyed hearing about fire in national parks, particularly Waterton. Not for the negative aspects of them, but for many of the positive aspects and sort of the work that you do. And again, thank you for the work that you do in fire and keeping communities and people safe. Again, I hope everyone enjoyed this evening's presentation.